Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Kira Bingaman. I'm the Adult Programming and Reference Librarian at the David and Joyce Milne Public Library. We are co-hosting tonight's talk, Climate Justice, Addressing the Disproportionate Impacts of Climate Change with the Southwick Public Library, also in Massachusetts, as part of Climate Preparedness Week. This is an annual event organized by the national group CREW, Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. Participating libraries and other groups seek to mitigate climate change, but also to better prepare our communities for current and future extreme weather events. Nia Keith is our presenter tonight. She is the social justice educator and consultant with more than 15 years experience working in nonprofits, schools, and cultural institutions. She is also Mass Audubon's first vice president for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, dedicated to cultivating equity and justice in all environments. Nia has spent her career motivating people to address environmental, social, and economic issues. As an educator, she designs and delivers interactive lessons for all ages to help people understand and take action to fight climate change. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Women's Studies from Ohio State University and a Master's in Environmental Studies from Antioch University, New England. After her talk, Nia will take questions from participants, but you can also post questions in the chat during the talk, and we will do our best to get to them possibly during and maybe after if there are a lot of questions. The David and Joyce Milne Public Library and the Southwick Public Library are delighted to have Nia with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Nia.
Thank you so much, Kira. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Christine, thanks so much for the Buckeye shout out. OHIO. My parents still actually live in Ohio. I'm so glad that we're all here today for our little talk about climate justice. I'm going to jump into it because we have a lot to cover, and it's going to feel maybe a little bit like drinking through a fire hose from time to time because there's so many things to talk about in this topic. But I do want to really encourage people to allow this to be an interactive program. So if people have questions, feel free to use the chat. You can also feel free to speak up. I'm going to pause and allow for opportunities for questions and interaction. People can unmute if they want to, and Kira's also going to keep her eye on the chat too. So please, this is really an opportunity for us to dialogue together. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. And Kira, can you just give me a thumbs up if the presentation is showing properly? All right, great. So before we go into the tofu of tonight's program, I want to start with an acknowledgement of land and history. Many people have probably seen organizations and institutions beginning to use land acknowledgements as a way of raising awareness around Indigenous rights and sovereignty, and also around the impacts of various different environmental justice issues on the land that we are currently occupying. So I'd like to take a moment to read this statement that I've created for the virtual space that we're in tonight. The environmental problems we are facing today are rooted in a history of exploitation, land theft, and genocide. But history has power if we are willing to see the truth of it and learn from the past. To that end, I'd like to begin this presentation by acknowledging that we are occupying the traditional, contemporary, and unceded territory of Indigenous peoples. The land and sea has long been rich with wildlife, plants, minerals, and trees. Indigenous peoples lived as part of the land and co-created abundant ecosystems long before European colonizers arrived. The land was taken from its original stewards, causing harm that continues to this day. And today, Indigenous communities across the globe, including the 37,000 people who reside in the state of Massachusetts, are at the front line of climate change activism, land stewardship efforts, and conservation. It's important that their voices and work are centered in the environmental movement. So I ask that everyone take some time to discover and elevate the work of Indigenous peoples, learn and speak the names of the people on the front lines of this movement. And lastly, we should all be thinking about and finding ways to help. Thank you. Okay, so to start us off, I would like to offer up this fairly lengthy definition of climate change. So we probably all, if we're here today, have some idea of what climate change is. But when I first started doing climate change education about 3 years ago, I found that the standard definitions that were being used, I didn't feel like they fully encompassed everything that needed to be talked about. So I developed this definition. So I'm going to read it out loud, and feel free also to follow along on the slide. And when I get to the end of it, I would like to hear from all of you, what is different about this definition than other definitions of climate change that you may have heard before? So I define climate change as a rapid change in global climate patterns, which is threatening the sustainability of human and natural systems, caused by human activities that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The effects of climate change can be mitigated through large-scale actions and policies that support natural climate solutions, reduce or eliminate greenhouse gases, and address social and economic disparities. So besides the length of it, what differences do you notice in this definition from others that you may have heard? Feel free to use the chat or unmute your microphone and talk to us.
I normally don't see a definition that focuses on solutions, and also one that focuses, I don't know if resiliency would be quite the right word, but often it's like just mitigation and not adaptation, all in one definition.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Christine. That is definitely one of the things that I intentionally put into this definition, was talking about solutions. I think it's critical that when we talk about climate change, we talk about solutions. And in fact, research has shown that in order to motivate people to action, you have to give people hope that there is a solution. So typically when people talk about climate change, we talk about impacts, and it can become very doom and gloom. And that can have the reverse goal of motivating people. It can actually cause people to withdraw from the topic. Anything else that people see that's different from this definition than from others they may have read or heard before?
Andrea mentioned that you talk about the human effects of climate change.
Yeah, and Andrea, that could refer to either the fact that I point out that it is human caused, which sometimes we don't see in there, but also the fact that it is impacting human systems, right? And I noticed in my work with climate change education that when people talked about climate change impacts, they often talked about it as if it was just something happening environmentally. And I'm like, well, it is, our environment is unraveling because of this, but it's impacting humans too. And why aren't we centering that experience? So you can see here that there's a couple of things that I was really intentional about in this definition, making sure that we talk about the fact that what is happening is rapid. This is not something that we have time to ponder. It's happening currently and it's moving quickly. The human piece that Andrea pointed out, yes, it's affecting humans, but also it's caused by humans. And then that piece that Christine's pointed out, the fact that I spoke about mitigation, that there are things we can do to make things right. And the last piece, which hadn't been brought up yet, that is unique to this definition, is that I point out that part of the solution has to be the addressing of social and economic disparities. And that is at the heart of what we are going to be talking about tonight. So although the impacts of climate change are being felt everywhere. Not everyone experiences the impacts proportionately. Some communities are impacted more than others, and sadly, the communities that have historically been the most oppressed and marginalized are the same communities that often experience the worst effects of environmental harm and degradation. And unfortunately, this is not happening by accident. The oppression that I'm talking about has been achieved systematically through laws, policies, and social norms for hundreds of years. The systematic oppression that I'm talking about was designed to uphold a global capitalist economy that was built by and depends upon the extraction and exploitation of natural resources and people. So in this system, those who perform the hardest labor are rarely the ones allowed to keep the wealth that comes from that labor. Meanwhile, they are the people who are often forced to live on the very land that is being stripped of its life-giving elements, and it leaves people deprived of the necessities and benefits of nature. And in other places, which we call sacrifice zones, we not only have spaces that have been impacted because the resources have been stripped away, because we are processing and using the resources of Mother Earth at a faster rate than natural systems can keep up, we are producing a great amount of waste and pollution from our extractive economy. And that waste and pollution has to end up somewhere. And that's what these sacrifice zones are. This is land that is considered worthy of sacrifice in exchange for progress and the growth of the economy. But when we look at where sacrifice zones end up, it's often on land that is occupied by people who are also considered expendable. I want to look at a couple of definitions here that you may have run into if you've already started to look into climate justice work. I want to talk about frontline communities and fence line communities. So frontline communities are communities that experience the first and worst consequences of climate change. These neighborhoods often lack basic infrastructure to support them and will be increasingly vulnerable as our climate deteriorates. So a fence line community, in contrast, is a community, is a neighborhood that is immediately adjacent to a polluting company and is directly affected by the noise, odors, chemical emissions, traffic parking, and other daily operations of that company. The effects of being exposed to such pollutants are exacerbated by climate change, impacting the health and economy of the residents in these fence line communities. And because race and racism has been used as the predominant tool to divide and undermine people in this country, we find that these climate vulnerable communities are often composed of people of color. I'm going to pause for a second and I'm going to let my cat out because she's screaming at me. 18-year-old cat, that's what you get. So these frontline and fence line communities are often composed of communities of color. But there's more at play here than just race. Although race is an indicator of success for every single dimension of human existence in this country. In other words, if you look at across identities, if you look at different groups of people with different education, different nationality backgrounds, different abilities, and you look at how race intersects with all of those different things, you will find that race is a determinant of success. People of color tend to have a lesser degree of success and survival on those indicators than people non-white or than white people. And so race is a baseline when we look at things, but it is not the only indicator of whether or not somebody may find themselves disproportionately impacted by climate change. Our identities are multifaceted and incorporating everything from our age and our education to our race and our gender expression. And the unique combination of all of those facets influence every part of our lives. I mean, everything from where we're most likely to live to how likely we are to have access to clean water can be determined by these overlapping identities. The term intersectionality, which you may have heard before, was first coined by lawyer and civil rights advocate Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And she brought up the term to try to describe the way overlapping identities create particular experiences of oppression. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, intersectionality is the complex cumulative way in which effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So when Kimberly Crenshaw brought this up, she was specifically speaking to the intersectionality of race and gender in the women's movement. And what she was trying to express was that women of color have a different experience of oppression because of the intersection with race. And she was trying to get people in the movement, which the movement at the time was predominantly white. She was trying to get people to understand that it was necessary to look at this intersectionality if they were going to really move all women forward, because the experience and therefore the challenges for a woman of color were different than a white woman. And that intersectionality had to be looked at. So intersectional oppression have put several populations at higher risk for climate change impacts. And we're going to talk about those populations now, and then I'm going to go through and talk about some of the ways that these intersectional identities could be at increased harm. So, of course, as I have mentioned, people of color are definitely tend to be at a higher risk or live in communities that are more vulnerable. But also, women and gender non-conforming people are at higher risk. People with disabilities, youth and children, the elderly, and then those people living in disinvested communities. And when I say disinvested, that's a very specific term. I don't use the term poor communities or economically disadvantaged communities, because there is a stigma in our society that if a person is poor, it has something to do with them personally. And oftentimes there's blame that is put on communities that lack various different like economic levers, as in like there's something wrong with the community itself. When the truth of the matter is there is a long history of systemic oppression that has created communities that lack infrastructure, opportunities, good schools, hospitals. These things have been determined purposefully. And in fact, laws and regulations and societal norms have created spaces where these communities have been disinvested. Money has actually been pulled out of these communities to allow them to thrive and move forward. And so I use this term really purposefully to make sure that we understand the systemic oppression context of why some communities are not developing in the same way as others. So let's take a moment to go through and look at each of these populations and how climate change impacts might be disproportionately affecting these populations. So race. Through practices such as redlining and other forms of systemic oppression, people of color often live in communities that bear the brunt of environmental harm. And if people aren't familiar with the term redlining or the practice of redlining, I'll say look it up, because it is a fascinating, if not a very sad piece of not so long ago American history. But at the turn of the 20th century, there was a practice that started with the government of assessing communities to determine whether or not they were a good fit for investment. And so communities were, they used maps, they would look at the communities and they would draw lines around the communities, and the color of the line determined whether the community was considered a really good investment risk or was considered a very poor investment risk. The communities that were considered a bad risk were outlined in red. And what that meant was that banks then would not give loans to people who wanted to build in those communities. It was difficult to get loans to purchase homes in those communities. And what happened was money wound up not going into those communities for things like developing green spaces and other like important community infrastructures. What did happen is that because these places were not highlighted as being good investments for creating living communities, they became cheap properties for people to purchase for industry. And so those communities that were redlined, drawn in line, tended to be communities of color. And in fact, we can look back at documents and see that the composition of the community by race could be the one determining factor that was used to decide that that community was not a good investment. Having as little as 5% of the population be Black was enough for it to be considered redlined. And so now when you go back and look at maps and you look at the most climate vulnerable communities in Massachusetts, they line up almost perfectly with the communities that were redlined back at the turn of the century. The impacts of that systemic oppression are still being felt today in the poor air quality, the lack of green space, and also a concentration of businesses and industry that is bringing in more pollutants that are exacerbated by climate change. So this comes in many forms, from fence line communities that are adjacent to the factories, as I talked about before, and power plants. And then, like I said, you could have overdevelopment in urban centers that have been stripped of tree canopies and green spaces. And not only does this take away benefits that are emotional and psychological, but it also, and physical for the residents, but the lack of green space also means that those spaces are going to be more prone to flooding during storms, more prone to heat. And as heat rises and storms become stronger, that means that those communities are going to be more likely to be impacted by the physical damaging pieces of climate change as well. And what we also have seen is that people of color are often working in occupations that bring them into closer contact with dangerous environmental conditions, and are also marginalized from having the political and economic power to change the systems that have created this whole thing. In fact, working class families and people of color face triple the unequal exposure effect to toxic pollutions and other environmental hazards in comparison to higher income residents. And for lower income communities and communities of color, this takes the form of greater concentrations of polluting industrial facilities and power plants, greater concentrations of hazardous waste sites and disposal treatment facilities, including landfills, incinerators, and trash. And then higher rates of on-the-job exposures to toxins. All of this can be attributed back to systemic racism. So now I want to turn and talk to gender. In the United States and globally, women are much more likely to be victims of poverty than men. This is just a statistical fact. What this means is that they are more likely to live in communities with fewer resources and communities with older infrastructure. So they are less likely to have access to healthcare. And all of this means that in the event of a climate disaster, women are more likely to die. And in fact, statistics show that women are 14 times more likely to die during a climate disaster than men. 14 times more likely to die because of these intersectional issues. And gender affects people's survival in other ways too. Women are more likely to experience violence during a displacement or an emergency situation. And transgendered and gender nonconforming people are 7 times more likely to experience violence at the hands of law enforcement. So when you think about somebody who is already dealing with trying to survive a climate disaster, flooding, let's say, or a major fire where you are having to leave your home, imagine the fear that comes with knowing that you are more, not only are you in your life in threat by the things that are happening to you environmentally, but the very people who might be there on the job that are supposed to help could be perpetrators of violence. And this all comes together and makes it harder for people with different gender expressions to survive. Ability. So when we look at ability, differences in cognitive ability, physical ability, and experiences of trauma can all impact a person's ability to adapt, to avoid, and to recover from a climate change impact. A person who is physically disabled might find it difficult to evacuate an area or locate a shelter that can accommodate their physical needs, leaving them vulnerable to impacts. And in fact, we have seen, unfortunately, over and over again, when there has been a natural disasters that have forced evacuations, where people who were on life-sustaining equipment were simply left behind. And so people with physical abilities might find that not only is there nowhere for them to be evacuated to, they may not be able to get the help they need to get out in time. A person with cognitive disabilities may not be able to sufficiently plan for a climate emergency or may have difficulties responding to the event in a timely manner, which could reduce their chances of survival. And a person who has experienced trauma or is suffering from other versions of mental health may not have the coping mechanisms to make appropriate decisions in the face of crisis. All these things making it harder for people to deal with climate change and the impacts, especially as those impacts increase. Age. So age is interesting because whether you are on the older end of the spectrum or the younger end of the spectrum, on those extremes, we see increased impacts from climate change on both ends. Let's look first at why young children might be more vulnerable. So children may be more vulnerable to climate change and its impacts and other environmental pollutants as well for a lot of reasons. For one, they have smaller bodies than adult people. And so that means if they're exposed to toxins, either because of environmental pollutants or because of an event like flooding that exposes toxins because you have like wastewater overflow and things, that those things can build up into their bodies and cause them to be ill quicker than it would for an adult. And even more so because their bodies are still forming, all these various different exposures could impact the way their body actually grows up and develops long-term, creating long-term health issues. The other thing that happens with children is that because women are still the primary caregivers of children, and women are more likely to find themselves in poverty than men, it means that children are also more likely to be impacted by poverty, which reduces their access to healthcare, education, and other resources that may determine their proximity to environmental hazards. On the other end of the spectrum, older people may suffer from climate change impacts because they might find themselves with deteriorating immune systems, which can lead to serious illness. So again, that impact to health, environmental health issues becomes stronger on a body that is not as strongly equipped to deal with it. They also might find themselves lacking mobility or having other impairments that come with age, just like we were talking about in the ability. This definitely comes up oftentimes for older people. And even another piece of the puzzle goes along with the fact that in this country, oftentimes elderly people suffer from social isolation from society. So during a climate disaster, when people are isolated from family and friends and other social structures, they might find themselves without the networks they need in order to be able to evacuate or get the resources they need to survive. And that opens them up to some of the worst impacts of climate change. I want to talk about class. So this is that disinvested communities aspect that I was speaking of earlier. So disinvested communities, many of which are also communities of color, if you'll recall, are the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. Due to generations of this disinvestment, These communities often have impaired infrastructures, and this leads to increased flooding, more property damage, and then displacement from people's homes. And oftentimes there's an insufficient amount of green space, right? Which I spoke of before. So that can cause what we call the heat island effect. And this is where residents can experience temperatures that are several degrees hotter than their suburban or rural counterparts. And that might not seem like a lot, but it's actually a huge difference. And I've experienced this myself in my job. I drive all around the state. And when I drive into the city, I can experience temperatures that are sometimes 7 degrees hotter than when I drive to suburban areas. And you can actually watch the thermometer in my car drop as I leave the city. So when you think about the increased amount of heat that we're experiencing, and where you think about having multiple days, even weeks of heat waves, and then that's bad enough. Now add 7 degrees to that. And then you think about the impacts. People will literally die from heat exposure. So this is another threat that happens in disinvested communities. And I also want to put out something, because this has come up in other conversations I've had about climate justice, is this belief that environmental racism can be written off as just a problem of money, and that it really has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with just the money. But I want to point out a study that was done by Dr. Carrie Ard, who is a researcher at The Ohio State University. And Dr. Ard found that African Americans who are living above the poverty line are still exposed to more toxins than white Americans who are living in poverty. And this is despite the fact that Blacks exhibit higher levels of organizational activism and political participation than their white counterparts. So like I was saying at the beginning, race cannot be discounted as an indicator of success. We've also seen how disinvested communities often lack the ability to rebuild after a disaster. These communities continue to be disinvested and under-resourced, and oftentimes the government does not provide enough money or resources to rebuild, and individual property owners may not have the money or the insurance to rebuild after a disaster without some kind of government assistance. This image that I am showing you here was taken 16 years after Katrina. This is New Orleans' lower 9th ward. 16 years later, this community has not been rebuilt and people cannot come home. So in summary of this section, I want to say that the roots of environmental exploitation are intertwined with the roots of human exploitation, and we cannot solve one without the other. Traditionally, the environmental movement has often ignored or sidelined the needs of those with marginalized identities. However, I really believe that we cannot solve climate change or any other environmental issue unless we start addressing the underlying social injustices and the system that brought us to this point. And that's why I'm a real believer in the slogan of there is no climate action without climate justice. So I'm going to pause here and ask what's bubbling up for people, questions, comments, disagreements. I just want to know, how is this landing for y'all? And again, feel free to use the chat, or if it's easier, unmute and use your microphone. While people are thinking, I just want to give a shout out to my friend Pallavi. Hi, Pallavi. I just saw that you're in the house.
Hey, Nia. Yeah, I joined a little late, but I'm so glad I'm finally here. I'm still in my car, so that's why I don't have my video on, but I was gonna chat.
Well, be safe in your car, and I'm glad you could join us. I just wanted to say hi.
So good to be here.
So anything bubbling up for anyone? Any thoughts, questions?
Andrea said that it's sobering. Thank you for this information. And Susan said, I have experienced the change from city to rural and mountain areas in upstate New York.
Yeah, and it's shocking, right? When you notice like how the difference in temperature, it really is kind of mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be just literally a few miles of driving and you can experience a really big difference. Anything else? I don't like to rush people, but I also want to make sure we get to talk about the second half of this presentation, which is all about solutions. Because I know that I just landed us with a lot of really sobering information, but I want to talk about the fact that there are things that we can do right now to save ourselves. All right, I'm going to move into the second half of our presentation, but feel free to continue to use the chat or to shout out if you have thoughts. Okay, so there are many ways that we can take climate action, but the goal of our actions really all needs to be one thing, and that is to reach a state of drawdown. Drawdown. According to Project Drawdown, which is a leading source in climate change solution, by the way, if you're not familiar with them, go to their website. It is just a treasure trove of information and solutions and actions, and it's really well organized and well researched, and it's wonderful. Project Drawdown. According to Project Drawdown, drawdown is the future point in time when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. This is the point when we begin the process of stopping further climate change and averting potentially catastrophic warming. It is a critical turning point for life on Earth. I find when I first learned about Drawdown, it changed everything for me in my climate change action journey, because it seemed like for the first time somebody was giving me concrete information that we don't have to just go down with the ship. We actually can right this vessel. We can fix this if we figure out, if we get together and we figure out what we're doing. So when I think about the different ways that we can address climate action, there's basically three things that will help us get to drawdown. And those three things are this, okay? One, we have to protect and support nature. So nature is this beautiful, beautiful thing because through natural biological and chemical processes, plants, soils, and oceans automatically remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it. And this is called carbon sequestration. So the Earth already has natural processes that will pull the excess carbon that we have pumped into the atmosphere that's making things too hot. We'll pull that carbon down and trap it so that it's not in the atmosphere, making things too warm. When we protect, and even better, we start restoring natural systems, it allows the Earth to do its thing and heal itself naturally. So that is a super important thing. We have to take actions to support and protect nature and natural systems. But it wouldn't matter how much green space we restored if we don't stop pumping the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So the second focus in order to get to drawdown is that we have to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, or at the very least drastically reduce them when complete elimination is not possible. So for example, there are certain natural processes that release greenhouse gases. I think we have all heard about the methane of cows. They release that just through their normal digestion. That's something that will never be completely eliminated unless we eliminate cows. And I don't want to eliminate cows because they're cute, but we can find ways to reduce the amount of emissions. So we want to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions when we can and drastically reduce them when complete elimination is not possible. If we can do that, and we can support nature in carbon sequestration, then we can actually start seeing the amount of greenhouse gases that is in the atmosphere now start to decline. But that is not the only thing. There is also a third component, and this goes to the heart of what we're talking about tonight. The third thing that we have to do is create a just and equitable society. That's all. But it's really important that we address the societal issue because, as I was saying before, human exploitation is connected to environmental exploitation and vice versa. If we don't address the societal problems, then they're going to crop up in another way, and those environmental problems will never go away. They might shift to a different location, but they will not go away. And we have to realize that we're all on this ball together. So even if we don't see the sacrifice zone outside our own window, the impacts are going to be felt nonetheless. So we have to address the societal inequities so that we can also address the environmental exploitation. So we need all three of these solutions working together in tandem to solve climate crisis. But since this presentation is about climate justice, I'm going to focus on that third component right now. And I'm going to start by giving two examples of some national movements that are addressing climate justice through a lens of equity. And I really am jazzed about both of these, so I'm really excited to share them with you today. One you've probably heard of before, but I'm going to share it anyway because I love them. So the first movement that I want to talk about is the Black farmers movement. And this is really close to my heart as a Black woman, but also as a person who has done work in sustainable agriculture. This movement to me is just it's such a great example of addressing not only an environmental issue, but addressing some societal issues as well. So a little bit of background, land has always been a source of wealth and prosperity. I think we all know that. And as early as the 1600s, laws were enacted that forbade Black people from owning land. So before this country was a country, Black people were put in a situation where they could not acquire wealth in that way. But during the Reconstruction period, which is the period that followed the American Civil War, the prospects of Black people started to improve. And an educated Black middle class actually rose up. And about 80% of that educated Black middle class were getting their societal advancement through the ownership of farms. But then the era of Jim Crow came, and it robbed many Black people of their hard-won wealth. And according to some sources, millions of acres of Black-owned land has been taken in just the past century. The land that Black farmers lost between 1910 and 1970 is worth $300 billion today. And most sources say that that is actually a conservative estimate. So what we have seen now is a rising up of Black, Indigenous, and other farmers of color that are using sustainable farming methods, often methods that are derived from traditional practices, to combat this issue. The other reason why sustainable farming has become a big issue in communities of color, particularly in Black communities, is because food insecurity has been a major problem. You have a lot of communities of color where access to fresh food is very limited. You may have heard the term food desert in the past. Now people often use the term food apartheid. And so the Black farmers movement and other movements of people of color to reclaim farmland came out of this desire to take care of problems in-house in their own communities. And so they have been transforming highly impacted spaces, usually urban spaces, into arable farmland. And so you have organizations like Soulfire Farm, which if you're not familiar with them, oh my goodness, look them up, they're amazing. Leah Penniman started Soulfire Farm, has written this fabulous book, Farming While Black. It's so inspiring.
They're not that far from where we are, actually.
No, I know, right? It's and I was gonna say they're like Massachusetts based. They're like amazing, so good. And what they've been doing is they've taken over abandoned lots and have turned them into farmland. And so why is this a climate solution? Well, it's creating acres of topsoil, and this cools ambient temperatures, it reduces flooding, it traps greenhouse gases, and it's also addressing other societal inequities because it's enabling food sovereignty. It's empowering people who have been marginalized to take charge of their own source of food. So it is both a climate solution and a societal, like a diversity solution. And so when we think about what I was saying before, there's like, those three aspects of getting to drawdown, right? Supporting nature, eliminating greenhouse gases, and addressing justice and equity issues. This Black farmers movement is hitting all those points, because by turning these gray spaces into green spaces, they are supporting and protecting nature, and they're creating topsoil. So they're restoring nature, right? By using sustainable farming practices, they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then by addressing food sovereignty issues, they are also increasing access to healthy food. And so they are going towards the just and equitable society. One movement doing three different things, getting us towards climate resiliency. I want to talk now about the Sunrise Movement. This is a powerful movement. Love them. This is a youth-led climate movement to stop climate change and create millions of good paying jobs in the process. I love that Sunrise ties the economy in with this and sees those things as absolutely necessary to address both. They take political action to demonstrate, educate, and communicate, and they also go out of their way to stand in solidarity with BIPOC liberation movements, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, liberation movements, such as the Movement for Black Lives. And if you haven't heard of them before, the Sunrise movements, they are the champions of the Green New Deal. So going back to those three things, like supporting nature, eliminating greenhouse gases, and addressing equity issues, Sunrise is doing that as well. They use their voices and their networks to influence political outcomes, to get elected politicians that are working to protect the land, reduce carbon emissions, and advance green energy solutions. So that's the first two bullets. And then because they are focused on creating a just transition into a green economy, they are actively working to replace the extractive and exploitative economy that is at the heart of the injustice issues we were speaking of before. So those are two really awesome, like, national movements that are addressing things. But before we close today, I want to make sure to talk about things at a little bit more like local and individual level as well. Because you might be sitting here going, Nia, that's really awesome, but I'm not a Black farmer, so I don't know how this pertains to me. Well, I want to talk about how we all could take individual action. Yes, you could also join Sunrise Movement if you wanted to, but there's other things we can do, and there's different levels. So I like to say that climate activism falls along a spectrum ranging from immediate and individual action to more committed and collective engagements. Ultimately, we need collective engagement to create the systemic change that will mitigate climate change. However, everyone's journey is different, and there are lots of ways to get involved, and it can be helpful to think of climate action at three levels. So let's go ahead and look at what climate action could look like at level one. We have to all start somewhere. And so at level one engagement, we're focused on educating ourselves. So being here tonight is climate action, learning more about climate justice. This is a step in the right direction, right? We also could be educating, raising the awareness of others around us, and spreading the word about climate justice. Having a conversation about climate change may not seem that important. You might be thinking, that doesn't do anything. But they have actually shown, research has shown that even though the majority of people in the United States believe climate change is real, the majority of people in the United States don't have conversations about climate change. So if we're not talking about it, how can we be working together to form solutions? So even just having conversations with your family, your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, and getting people getting people excited about being involved is an important aspect of climate work. I also think it's really important for people to expand their networks. When we talk about talking to people as a solution, let's also think about reaching out and maybe talking to people that aren't normally parts of our networks. And also, let's think more broadly about who we invite to the table when we're having a conversation about climate change. It seems really obvious to reach out to environmental organizations, but there's lots of intersecting issues that also are connected to climate change, and a lot of organizations that are doing work that also is connected to climate change that may not seem so on the surface. So expand your network and look at organizations that are working towards working on food security issues, public health issues, access to green space, green transportation, clean energy. These are all connected. So reach out there and like get involved with an organization that maybe you hadn't thought of as a climate organization before. Okay, so maybe you're like, that's too simple. I'm ready to do more, Nia. Tell me what's the next step. Climate action level 2, okay? This is when we started getting into more collective and community-based action. These actions include things like joining a group that's organizing and advocating around climate change, or maybe hosting a community-based event, or lobbying your representatives, or organizing your neighborhood to collectively purchase renewable energy or form a composting system. These things are all a part of level 2 action. I want to focus in on something that I think is really interesting is getting involved in local government decisions. So in decisions involving infrastructure and energy options are often made at the local level, and a lot of people don't realize that. So one of the things that you can do to get involved at the local level and have actually really big impacts is you can support your town or city's local climate initiatives. Massachusetts has been a leader in climate resiliency with its Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the MVP. Your town that you're living in, I could guarantee you has an MVP plan because nearly every single town in Massachusetts has, if not 1, 2 MVP grants. And what the MVP is, which is why I think it's so fascinating and wonderful, is that towns can go to the state, you apply for a grant, and that grant can be used. The first grant is a grant that allows the town to do an assessment and create a plan for climate resiliency. The second grant, which they get after the first, obviously, allows them to implement the plan. Anyone who is a resident of the town has the right to be involved with the MVP process. You can have your say about what your town's climate resiliency plan looks like and how it's rolled out. So go to mass.gov and look up your town and see where they're at in the MVP process, because I mean, people want impact and they want it local. This is one of the best and even easiest ways to do that. Okay, now we're at climate action level 3. This is when we're really putting ourselves out there on the front line. And this kind of work may not appeal to everyone because sometimes it can be a little bit more in your face. But these are the kind of actions that also tend to really raise awareness because they get a lot of attention. So things at this level could include organizing a protest or a rally, participating in a mass strike or a walkout, or a collective boycott, or, and this one is a little bit less like public, but I think maybe one of the most important, disinvesting from polluting companies and institutions. So when I talk about that, disinvesting from fossil fuels, I am talking about like the idea of where companies get their money, right? So most of us are pretty much aware that like if you have a public company, they are selling stock on the stock exchange, and that's how they make a lot of the money for their operations. When we have retirement plans and things like that, what's happening is that we're buying shares in these companies and actually helping them grow. We're giving them the money to go forth and do what they do. So one of the things that can be extremely powerful is taking control of where your monies are invested. So for example, when I was speaking to the person who manages my retirement fund, I requested that they not invest in any fossil fuel companies. So the money that I have go in my retirement fund doesn't go into any company that is working in the fossil fuel industry. There's also been successful disinvestments at other like institutional levels. I have spoken with organizers at universities that have been able to get their universities to disinvest all their endowments and investments from fossil fuels. At Mass Audubon, where I work, we have successfully disinvested our monies from fossil fuel companies so that they're not gaining from the work that we're doing. And so I highly encourage people to advocate for disinvestment at your work or school. And if you have control over your own personal account, disinvest from your accounts. You can also look into banking with green financial institutions, which are now readily available online and fully supported and secured like any bank you would find on your street corner, but they actually specialize in investing in green solutions and companies. So we can all put our dollars where our heart is. The last thing I want to say before I close is that getting to Drawdown will take time and determination, and therefore we all need something to help us remain hopeful and keep us engaged in the fight. And maybe you're doing it for the animals whose habitat is threatened, or maybe you're doing it to protect the coastal town you grew up in, or maybe you're doing it for the next generation who will inherit the planet we leave behind. It doesn't really matter why we do it. It matters that we continue to look at that why and we hold it as a form of hope. I genuinely believe that hope is a form of climate resilience. And so this is what's going to keep us engaged and keep us going so that we can ultimately win this battle together. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for any comments or questions. Yay, Pallavi made it home. All righty, now I can see the chat again. Yay!
Do you want me to read them to you? Or
No,
do you-
now I can see them. Thank you, Kira.
Okay.
All right, so I see Andrea, I live in a mostly white privileged community. Is there a way that I can work for climate action and still help with the climate justice in my region? I mean, yeah, and hopefully some of the things that I just put forward resonated with you. Did you feel that any of those components were things that you could see yourself doing, Andrea? Or I'm not sure if it's Andrea. I also want to point out Pallavi's piece in the chat. Thank you for adding this. Is that another way of getting involved with your local government is to join your conservation commission or your climate committee? Yes, people, join the local CONCOM. Pallavi, do you want to talk about the CONCOMs really quick?
Sure, happy to. So I serve on the Conservation Commission for Brookline, which is where I live, and I'm the only non-white commissioner. But I will say that having diversity in representation is a huge issue across the state. And there's an organization called Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissioners who are really taking this to heart and trying to have as much participation from BIPOC individuals, especially those who are interested in environmental issues and want to be a part of local action. And so I would plug joining your Conservation Commission. What they are tasked to do is really be the protectors of wetlands and other water resources in the town. And every project that impacts those water resources has to go through the commission for review. And so you have the ability to shape the projects that are happening in your community, but also really kind of make the connection between water resource protection and climate change. So it's a really useful way to kind of influence how things are done in your town. And typically you don't need to it's a volunteer position. So it's not that you have to be very familiar with all the regs or any of that. You can just tell your commission that you're interested in serving and start as soon as they have an opening.
There you go. And to go to Andrea's question around, like, if you live in a mostly white privileged community, how can you help? I think that anytime we know we have an identity that has privilege or platform, being able to take that privilege and platform and using it to raise the awareness of the people who are marginalized and provide space where their voices can shine is something we can do. Like, so even if you're like, I'm white, what do? Like, Well, knowing that like that comes with a certain amount of exposure typically and a certain amount of platform that may not be available to people of color, and then use that to give some space to voices that may not be heard. So I highly encourage people to get involved no matter what, get involved. And if you're like, yeah, I'm a person who wants to bring equity work in, you'd be surprised how frequently the spaces that you go into are not having conversations about equity. So even if you become the first voice in the room that's like, let's talk about that, that in and of itself is a climate justice action. So I really encourage that.
I have a question about the banks that you mentioned. Are there some banks that are greener than others?
Yeah, I mean,
and how do you find out?
Yeah, I mean, you can actually go ahead and you can do like a Google search for like a green banking institution, and they come up. There's institutions that they build their wealth around investing in environmental protection, in companies that are creating green solutions. Whereas like your average banking industry, they are investing in whatever company is going to have the biggest return on investment, and regardless of what that industry is, right? And so that's like the difference. So if you are, many of us probably have like a 401k or something to that effect from our jobs. If you look at that, I don't know about y'all, but I get back these like every quarter, these like sheets of things where they give you like all the list of stuff that like the bundles that they're investing your money in. You can actually see exactly what companies your money is going to support. And more likely than not, because they tend to want to diversify your portfolio, they've actually got industries broken down into, I think it's something like 14 different sectors. I can guarantee you at least that they are investing in a fossil fuel sector because it is a big return on investment. So if you're not telling them not to put your money in there, I can pretty much guarantee it that that's what they are doing, because that is just a traditional financing option. But if you Google the green financial industries, you can find ones where that is not part of any portfolio that they build.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? Ruminations?
Nia, I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about building the pipeline for students who are interested in this kind of work. So if you have a school in your town, and I do that at my children's school. I kind of lead their environmental club, and the teachers welcome it because they just kind of give me a slot of 20 minutes and I come in and do my presentation, and the kids are really like excited about the environment. And so there's so many ways you can educate the kids and get them inspired about doing work in this field. And I think that's a really good way to engage youth, because they have to be living with this world that we're leaving with them. So I think it's very important for them to know more about the challenges, but also opportunities.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, Flavia. I also love that you're running an environmental club at your children's school. That's so great. Yeah. I mean, I think that is it's so important, like as an environmental educator and like a formal classroom teacher in my past, like obviously I live for all of that. I think it's great. And the other thing that's really awesome is there's so many resources online now, more than they used to be, like free curricula. But if you're like, yeah, I want to start leading these conversations with youth, you can actually just go online and find really amazing resources and start doing this. I would also say that if you have tweens and teens in your life that you would like to support, Mass Audubon has a really amazing youth program called the Youth Climate Leadership Program. And what we do is we support these youth climate leadership clubs. and it's a youth-centered climate justice action program. So we have adult mentors that work with them, but what they do is they actually support the youth in thinking through how they are going to engage other youth in climate action. And so each year, the central team of the club comes together and they spend several months organizing and producing what they call a youth climate summit. And these summits, they invite youth from all over their region. In the past, we've had summits that brought in 200 young people for anywhere from a day to 2 days of climate education and action. They come together, there's usually workshops and speakers around various different climate justice things. There's, they talk about stuff like, art and climate justice. They learn how to prepare, like how to fix a bicycle, but they also learn about much bigger things as well. But the part that I think is so cool is beyond the education, every climate summit also has a portion where the youth come together in groups. Usually they're based on like the school they're in or the after school club that they're belonging to. And they all create a climate action plan that's specific to their school or neighborhood. And then the central group of kids supports all of those teams over the course of the rest of the school year to implement their climate action plan in their community or their school. And then some of them have what they call a showcase. So at the end of the school year, they invite all the teams to come back and show off their climate action plan and what they were able to do. It's a really amazing, robust program. And we have it in 6 different regions in the state now. So if you have young people in your world, I highly encourage you to look into the Youth Climate Leadership Program. I can't say enough good stuff about it.
Well, I didn't know about that.
Yeah. Anything else that's coming up for people?
You mentioned at one point that it's hard for people that it's important for people to talk about climate change as much as possible, but I find it's difficult to do that. Like people don't want to talk about it, and it can really shut down a chat you might be having with someone. It's difficult, and I don't know if you have any tips or thoughts about that.
I do. I have lots of in fact, I have a whole presentation I do on climate change communications, which is just like, how do you talk to people about climate change? Yeah, and like I think a lot of it comes from the fact that a lot of people, when they approach the conversation about climate change, because it is so daunting and scary, that, as I had mentioned at the beginning, we kind of fall into this doom or gloom pattern. And that is something that most people will duck away from that, right? Most people don't lead with action or solutions. So I really encourage, if you want to start engaging people in a conversation, instead of jumping in with like, hey, here's the latest thing I heard about ocean acidification, woof, it's really destroying the planet. Be like, hey, have you heard about this new, green technology? Like, it's really fascinating, and they think this could be a major solution towards climate change. And like engage people in talking about solutions. Another really cool event, if anybody feels like organizing an event, we used to do this when I was in my former position before coming into the VP role. I used to work with a team at Mass Audubon, and we would do what we call climate cafes. We didn't start this, other people did, but we started adopting them and helping people around the state organize them. And what they are is they're like really chill, low key, like low risk social opportunities for people to come together. We would often hold them at like a brewery or a library. And it was an opportunity for people to come together, usually with snacks and goodies. And then we would pose some kind of climate topic. There might be a really short presentation that was like maybe 20 minutes max. And then the rest of the time, people were grouped together with, people at their table. It doesn't have to be people they know. In fact, oftentimes it might be people they didn't in their community. And then they were just given like little cue cards with different like kind of conversation starters. And the whole point was simply to get people to talk. It was not intended to be like some kind of hard hitting, like science education piece. It was just to get people in their community talking to other people in the community about climate change. And sometimes it could be centered around like experiences of art or experiences of seeing a change in like a place that was important to them. The topics could be were variable. But we had a lot of success with climate cafes. And now that we're in the endemic portion of dealing with COVID, I'm hoping to see a rise of climate cafes again as a way for people to socialize and to start having these conversations. We also used to do trivia sometimes.
It makes it fun.
Yeah, you know, a little trivia, you know, a little beer flight, and and you talk about climate change.
Beer, then I'm sure that would get people to come.
Our most popular ones actually were at local breweries. They just turned out to be like spots where people were really comfortable. And it sounds like, oh, it's an adult thing, but honestly, we actually had lots of families that brought children to the event. So it just, interestingly enough, it just became a place where a lot of people in the communities were comfortable coming that spanned age interest. Go figure.
Interesting.
I know, when I first found out about it, I was like, are you serious? You're doing this at breweries? But it worked.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, Nia, about you know, the DEI efforts. I'm not sure if everybody else on this call meeting has efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in their workplace. And you know, I've heard mixed reactions based on, you know, who's doing what, but I was wondering if anybody wants to share their experience, if that is something that you've been involved in at work.
Yeah, love to hear people talk about that.
I can say I work in a library that's working on inclusion as a mission statement and a 5-year plan to change up the way things are done developmentally, training wise. And as I said, I'm in upstate New York, so it's taking a while. We're very, you know, the city is extremely rich with diversity. Suburbs aren't.
Mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
But that's encouraging that y'all are building you're building equity into your 5-year plan. That's big.
Yeah. And I'm part of that with the whole entire network of libraries. Like that includes all the city libraries, the suburb, and the rural. Yeah. Onondaga County.
I love that.
It's a lot of work. It's not easy.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely a lot of work, and mostly you're expected to kind of do this on your own time, so that makes it even harder.
Yeah, I'm allowed to get to do this at work. So I think that's great.
Yeah. I, for one, I feel really encouraged by the shift that I've seen in diversity work in the United States. You know, I feel like 10 years ago, if people had a diversity initiative, it was exactly that. It was like kind of a one-off initiative. It maybe belonged in the hands of a small committee. The committee often was not formed by people with the most institutional power in the organization. So they really had no like leverage to do anything with whatever the initiative was. And now I'm starting to see more of what Susan just shared, which is like people actually building it into their strategic plans instead of it being a separate initiative. People are actually making it core to their deliverables, and thinking more intentionally about how does this actually help us meet our mission? How is this like necessary for meeting our mission? And I love that shift. It's such a shift in the right direction. So thanks, Pallavi, for posing the question, and thank you, Susan, for sharing your experience.
Yep.
Mary?
Hi, I just wanted to share that I'm a member of Zonta International. Zonta is an organization of well over 100 years old, and it's in 68 countries. And for the first time this past year, we've decided that our purpose is to improve the lives of women and girls all over the world. And we do that in many, many different ways. And typically, one of the things that we worked on this year was in Massachusetts is raising the age for marriage to 18. In Massachusetts, you could get married at 12. And so no longer is that possible. And women who are married and under 18 can now get out of that marriage if they need to. This year, we're starting to work on climate. And the reason we are doing that is because we've learned through a lot of studies and experience that women are typically more affected, by climate change. Women of all in all countries and all sorts for many different reasons. So I'm here to learn more about how we can spread that message locally. And it's easy to talk about how women are impacted in marginalized societies in other countries. It's a little bit more difficult here in Massachusetts, as an example. So I'm looking for ideas and how we can spread that. And I've heard so many wonderful things, and I thank you so much for being with us tonight. I've learned a lot, and I want to get a hold of you and talk to you about conversations.
Yes, I'll put my my email in here.
Actually, we just got it.
Oh, I gave it to Mary, but I could share it with everybody for you if you want. Just your the work email.
Yeah, I mean, I was almost finished typing it. There it is.
Okay.
Yeah, and Andrea, thank you for pointing that out, because that was actually on my head, is that Project Drawdown actually lists educating women as one of the most influential ways to deal with climate change. So like, I was thinking that, Mary, when you were saying it, I'm like, yeah, like it's another one of those things that's like an indicator that kind of crosses through a lot of things, like educating women impacts poverty, it impacts environmental justice issues, it impacts so many things because of that, all the intersections of oppression that people experience. And like gender expression, gender identity is definitely one of those cornerstones, right? It's one of those cornerstones. So I would love, Mary, if you're willing to, I would love it if you could drop a link to your organization in the chat, because I would
I would
very
be
much
happy
like to see what work they're doing, because it sounds really wonderful. And I like that you're thinking about how do we bring this locally to address the disproportionate impacts to women here in Massachusetts.
Zonta.org is our main organization. You'll find what we're doing on climate change. We have a statement on climate change, and every club in the world has been asked to work on climate change this year, to have one thing that they do in their community. And so I'm just one of hundreds of clubs, around the world that are working on some ideas. So thank you.
That's great. I have so many questions for you now. About the
well, I want to talk to you too. So,
and I'm like,
thanks.
Anything else that is coming up for people? Other questions, comments, resources? I love when people share their resources.
Doesn't Mass Audubon also have a, you can be a climate warrior?
Climate champion.
Climate champion. Okay.
Yeah, so I believe we just launched it this year. You would think I would know more, but I've been busy. We launched the Climate Championship program this summer. Yeah, and the goal of it is actually to recruit 1,000 climate champions, a minimum of 1,000 climate champions, who are people who get specific education around how to mobilize their communities towards climate advocacy. So really thinking about climate advocacy at the state level, which is where we do a lot of our work. So if people are looking for a way to get involved locally, but also at like a regional and a state level, you can go to Mass Audubon, and I believe there's a digital form that you can fill out. I can actually probably find it right now, that you can sign up to be a climate champion. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. I don't know why I didn't think of it.
I just ran across it at one point.
Like I said, I've been busy. Yeah. Thank you, Christine, for being here. And it seems like maybe people are feeling pretty good. We might be able to wrap up.
Yeah, I think so. Does anyone else have any more questions or comments?
I was just going to plug another amazing program at Mass Audubon, Nature and City. And I was recently at Magazine Beach when there was an event organized. It was fantastic. Local music group who, with youth playing, and it was just, so anybody who lives in the Cambridge, Boston area, I would recommend going to the Mass Audubon. It's not, I don't know what it's called, the Center for
It's called Magazine Beach Park Nature Center. Magazine Beach Park Nature Center. It's like the most convoluted name. It's not all our fault.
But it's a beautiful space and it's a beautiful park. So, and right in the city, so not too far.
And the Nature in the City program is actually one of our flagship programs in our 5-year action agenda, which we just adopted last year. So we're in year 2 of that. And we're actually going to be doing Nature in the City programs in multiple gateway cities across the state. But right now we're working in Boston. We have Cambridge at Magazine Beach, and then we have a Lowell. We have a place in Lowell that we are now working with the community there to preserve the last farmland in Lowell, and it's going to become a nature center. And it's pretty amazing. Yeah, so super excited. I forget how many acres it is, but it's a nice size. We're gonna rewild it because right now it's a functioning Christmas tree farm. It's been in the owner's family for a couple of generations. He's looking to retire. No one else in the family is taking it over, and he's worked with Mass Audubon, the city, and some of our partners to allow the acquisition of this and the conservation of that land. So it will be rewilded, and there will be trails that will go on it, and education opportunities and programs. And right now we're engaging the residents of the city to find out what exactly is it that they want this land to be, what is it that they need from this space, and really co-creating a green space that is centered on the needs of the community. So that's another one of the Nature in the City pieces that we're working on. But hopefully in the next 5 years, we'll also be looking at working in Springfield, New Bedford, Fall River, Lawrence. We're hoping to really increase green space all around the Commonwealth.
Amazing. That's amazing.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah,
this was
thank
great.
you, everyone.
Thank you, Nia.
Very informative. I look forward to getting a copy of the video. It really exceptional job. Thank you, Nia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation. Everyone have a wonderful night. I'm gonna go eat my dinner.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nia.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
appreciate it.
Bye.
Have a good night.